Okay, so I'm Brenda Grum. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the National Director of Resident Experience for all of Anthology. And it is awesome to be with you all today. This is part of a quarterly virtual education session for families. And so we always record and make that available. It's on our YouTube channel, or if you need the link, just ping me. Or if you maybe wanted to listen to one of our previous sessions, you are more than welcome. I started this about 6 months ago. So our first one was on dementia and the holidays. And I just want to highlight, I was thinking as I was driving this morning to one of our communities where I am right now, um, is that even though the first one was dementia and the holidays, and we are now in April, there's still some good tips there that you may find might be helpful in the upcoming holidays that you and your person are celebrating, or maybe upcoming birthdays that you all are celebrating. And I'll come to that in just a sec. So that might be a good resource for you all. The second session that I did was in January, and that was called Communication Tips. There'll be a couple things that I echo today from that session. So if you were one of the many attendees in that session, don't get discouraged if you hear a couple repetitive stuff. There'll be other stuff that is new. And somebody asks if I can make my window differently. So the person who asked that, if you are on your phone, you should be able to maybe swipe left or right, and you might be able to see it bigger. And if, oh, that was Rita. But you are on your laptop, so you might be able to expand it on your laptop, I think. I apologize, Rita. Okay, so we're going to talk through today different ways to connect with your person through common dementia symptoms. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we pivot there, but I pulled out 7 specific ways to connect. I sort of hemmed and hawed the last few days as I was tweaking this to figure out, what really are the quote unquote right items to include, but I wanted to share things that I think are applicable for all of us as loved ones, as family members of choice, as professionals, things that are easily implementable, easily actionable for us, and that will really make a difference for our person. And at the end, I included some other methods and resources as well. And like I said at the beginning, or at least for some of you at the beginning, I will keep an eye on the chat as we go through. So if there is something that has you excited, or something that isn't clear, or something that sparks another question for you, I want you to feel totally empowered to put that in the chat, and I will either address it as we're going along, or at the very end, I will stop the recording and then we can unmute and take questions as well. Sound okay? Okay, excellent. So I support all of our communities, all of the memory care teams, and all of the engagement teams. I'm not good about talking about myself, so I guess I'll just say I hold a number of dementia credentials, and I'm a Forbes Health Advisory board member, and some other things. But really, for our purposes today, I am passionate about individuals who are on either a journey with dementia, or cognitive impact, or mild cognitive impairment, etc. That's something I'm super passionate about. And my main focus is on communication tips and how we can modify our approach so our person can be successful. So today's session is all around common dementia symptoms and ways that we can connect with our person through those. So the first slide we're seeing, if you're seeing the slides, and if you're on your phone, or if you're in a spot where you can't see the slides, I'll describe if something is especially visually important, but otherwise don't worry. And if you want a copy of these slides at the end, just shoot me an email. You probably have that in the invite you saw, or I'll put it in the chat. So I think the first place for us to start in our session today is that when we talk about the dementias in general, many of them are whole brain diseases. So I find when I talk with professionals or with families that often the first thing we think of when we think of dementia, we often first think of Alzheimer's. And after that, we think of short term memory loss. But the dementias impact so much of the brain. And I'm kind of harping on this because I think sometimes if we only think of memory loss, then we have a rougher time with our person because we don't understand why they do some of the stuff that they do, or why we're in conflict, or why we're out of sync. So that's why we're going to talk through some of these common symptoms today. And if we've spent time together, either in person in one of our communities, or if you've been on any of my webinars, you know that I like to sort of go off the cuff. So we might share some other stuff as well that are common in the dementia journey that I didn't include in the deck. But what you're seeing on the screen right now are examples on the top of scans of healthy brains as compared with the scans on the bottom. Those are scans of a brain with advanced Alzheimer's. And I'm sure many of you have seen images like this. I like to show them because, you know, David, if I had a broken arm, you would see that on me. You would see me, how I hold my arm, you'd see the cast, you'd see the sling. It would give you a sense of what's going on. But when I have dementia or mild cognitive impairment or Lewy body or whatever, you can't see into my brain. And so you can't see the gaps and the atrophy and the sections that are impacted. So I like to show these scans. I don't think these scans are depressing. I think these scans are empowering because they give us a sense. If you're seeing the scans, you're seeing the top are these full brains. There's a little bit of gap in the middle and sort of like little tendrils around the outside that have gaps. But all in all, it's a lot of brain matter. But if you look on the bottom set of scans, there are huge gaps missing. And what I look at instead are the parts that remain. So it gives us a sense of where our footing is with our person and where we can be successful. So I picked out 7 particular common symptoms of the dementia journey in general, and then some specific approaches or methods that you can use to still connect with your person. So before I dive into the first one, which is physical approach, I should clarify just in case we haven't spent time together before. So just to clarify some terms. So dementia, quote unquote dementia, is a general term, is not a specific diagnosis. The one exception of that is if your person was diagnosed with mixed dementia. So that means more than one specific diagnosis of dementia. So it might be Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, for example. But dementia generally is just a general term, is not a specific diagnosis. When we talk about the specific diagnoses, the 4 most common or 5 most common are Alzheimer's disease, and that can be traditional or early onset, vascular dementia that I mentioned just a moment ago, Lewy body dementia, frontal temporal degeneration, and then Parkinson's related dementia. So those are the most common. There are many others that we won't go into, but that's just to give us a starting place on terms. As we talk through today, if there's something that is particularly common in one of the specific diagnoses, I'll highlight that. But in general, we're talking about the general dementia journey or the general cognitive impact journey. So first of our 7 common symptoms is that very often our person has impacted visual perception. So you see at the bottom right of the corner, I reference Teepa Snow's positive physical approach, or what she calls PPA. But if you've ever seen her videos, she does a really great job of describing how somebody's vision can be impacted in the dementia journey. And I'll highlight a few different things. One, very often our person has a limited field of view. So if you're a kinesthetic person and you want to do what I'm doing right now and hold your hands up in sort of this circle right here, this is the field of view I usually assume an individual has, which means I usually assume that somebody does not have all of this periphery or may not have this lower or upper section of visual perception. So that impacts how I physically approach somebody. If somebody is, maybe I'm a primary care partner and my person is living with me in the home and I'm going to set down their plate of lunch, I want to make sure I don't just slip it in right here under where they can see, but I want to make sure they see it and then see it drop down. So that field of view is often impacted. Now, as we talk through today, your person may not have impacts in all of these 7 categories, but these are all pretty common. So that's how I picked them. Your person may have plenty field of view, or you may find that maybe they seem to have less awareness if they're ambulating in what's going on around them. Or you think back, if they're still driving or they were recently driving, you think back and say, ah, yes, now that I think about it, I noticed they couldn't really keep track of the vehicles in the other lanes. So that's an example. Other impacts to visual perception um, are depth perception, both the actuality of depth perception as well as the speed of processing. So sometimes, and I'm thinking of a particular gentleman I just recently met, sometimes you'll see somebody go to grab something, and instead of grabbing it here, they sort of like miss it. It's close, but they can't quite catch the right thing. So sometimes that is a depth perception, or like I mentioned, speed of processing. So maybe Gia approaches me and we're in a community and she comes up to me quickly. I can process her approach and I can see her coming. But if I am on a dementia journey or I have MCI or some other cognitive impact, she may approach and it may be so fast for me that I'm not really processing until she's right here in my space. There's a number of other things around visual perception. One we talk about a lot. You may notice when your person is ambulating and the flooring changes, you may notice they're uncertain about that, kind of not processing. Is it a step up, a step down? Is it a hole? Do they need to go around it, etc.? And then I wasn't going to mention this, but as I'm talking, uh, I think sometimes about wayfindings. Where is let me make sure I can see myself. Oh, I lost myself. Anyway, that's fine. But when you think of wayfinding, so sometimes, especially if your person is a resident in one of our communities, I'll sometimes see families or families of choice put up signs in the resident's apartment, like, hey, dad, make sure to do A, B, or C. Or, the dining room is this way, or, leave your apartment and go to the right. Those sorts of directional signs. There's some really great research and science around directional signs and what is easier for somebody with dementia to process. So some good rules of thumbs are contrast. You want to have a real clear contrast. So not like, hypothetically a gray font on a gray background or something like that. You want to have it be really contrasting. And then the location of where it is placed on the wall, for example. So if somebody is in an assistive device like a wheelchair, you want to make sure it's lower. You want to make sure it's at the edge of like the turn or the door or the wall. some other things like that. But anyway, I digress because I got really excited about this article. That's so great. So, with the common visual impacts, one of the best things we can do is approach our person intentionally. So if you're seeing the screen, you're seeing the physical approach, which is Teepa Snow's method. And if you aren't familiar with her, she is incredible. She's a dementia specialist. You can find her stuff on YouTube, on social media, etc. Just really powerful, impactful, practical tips. And so her physical approach, I should have planned, I'm a little bit too close to the wall to do this. But the key here, and this is my explanation of her approach, is the first step we want to do is before we get into our person's space, their personal space, we want to get their attention outside of it first. So you're thinking about your person, take just a moment to think about the last couple times you visited them. Did you notice that they saw you or perceived you right away? Or was it at a certain point as you approached them that they seemed to see you or process you or recognize you? If your person has vision deficits, you may be thinking about their hearing. When did they seem to process when you approach? So very often we approach just quickly, like, hi, I'm so excited to see you, a big hug, or you approach from behind. But keeping in mind our person's possible visual perception impacts, we want to first wait outside that personal space and get their attention. Now, Tifa would tell us, I don't know if you can hear it, but we're celebrating Spirit Week in our communities. And there's like clapping and music in the background. It's awesome. Somebody put in the chat if it's too loud and I'll close the door. We first wait outside their personal space. We get their attention. So you might say, hi, Mom. You might say, hi, Loretta. I'm going to say a thing about names in just a sec. Now, the next thing might feel a bit awkward for some of you, but I encourage you, if you're at all willing, just to try it and see how it goes. And to offer your hand in a handshake. Now, this might be odd for some of you. Maybe this isn't the relationship you have with your person. I do this all of the time when I'm greeting loved ones, residents, individuals in the community, like out in the world, etc., because it is a way for me to communicate without saying anything. So I offer my hand in a handshake, and David can take it, and I know what he's giving me at that point. Or he can sort of step back or kind of scowl at me. And then the point is, he's communicating with me, I'm communicating with him, even before we're in the space together. Number 3, you want to position yourself off to the side. Now, for some of you, I think this is probably like, oh, I can't believe she's talking about this. And it's so nitpicky and so specific, but there's a reason for it. So think about your person. If they have impacted field of view, and I approach, right? And square shoulders, I'm like, hey, I'm so happy to see you. Like I have blocked their whole visual space with my body. So what Tipa would tell us is you want to come sort of off to the side, have your body turned out a bit so that you're not blocking the world for your person. And then number 4, I've offered my hand, David's taken it. I'm going to come up to him, and then we're going to stand kind of shoulder to shoulder, or if he's seated or if he's in an assistive device, I'm going to sit down next to him. And I'm just going to still hold on to his hand. We're going to begin our chit chat. So for some of you, this probably feels a little bit awkward or prescriptive. But for other of you, you might be saying like, oh, I used to know how to visit with my uncle. We used to, gab all the time, and now I'm not really sure. Like he's at a later stage of his journey. I'm not sure how to visit with him because we need to modify our approach as our person continues on their journey. So physical approach, I think, is super, super powerful. I and we teach it to our care teams all the time because it can really impact how well the interaction goes. If I am assisting somebody with the restroom and I sort of blast in and I'm in their space and I'm juggling with their pants, like it's not going to go well. But slowing down, having that physical approach, having it be positive and in a way that our person can process is beneficial. I skipped over, I know a bunch of you asked for the slides and the, oh, Dana says hello, everybody. I know a bunch of you asked for the slides and I'm gonna ask you, actually, I'm gonna put it in the chat right now. B. Gurung. Okay, good. I just put my email in the chat, bgurung@anthologyseniorliving.com. Just ping me because I probably have your email since you registered, but I don't want to miss anybody. And I'll send you the slides, no problem. Okay, second common impact in the dementia journey is communication. And that's both, communication is a two-way street. So that's both our person's ability to understand what we're communicating and their ability to communicate back to us. So overall, best practice is, and this is going to take some work for some of us, right? I bet there are some of us on this call today that we just speak. Whatever comes to mind is what we say. And for a person who's on a dementia journey, they will benefit and we will benefit if we first think about what we're going to say before we say it. And so the overall message here I'll share is that when we speak in short, complete sentences with our person, and then we wait. We're going to be comfortable in the silence, comfortable in their time to process and decide, think about what they want to say, and then to say it if they're able. So in communication, I think two of the hardest things, but so doable and so impactful, are for us to first think about what we speak and be intentional about those sentences. I like to think of those sentences as a little gift. I'm going to make a little package for my person and say it. I'm not going to do what I'm doing right now, which is this never ending, like nonstop rambling run on sentence. It just goes and goes and goes. I want to speak in a short, clear sentence and then wait. Now, in the waiting, I think it's often waiting that's probably uncomfortable for us because for some of us, we think like, did my mom understand what I said? Maybe I should say it again. Maybe I should say it in a different way because that'll help her understand. But in the meantime, if your person is thinking about what you said, thinking about what their reaction is, and then trying to decide, like, and you jump in to rephrase it, you've derailed them. So short, complete sentences, then pause. Now, with communication, there's a number of ways that communication can be impacted in the dementia journey. Sometimes it's just a speed of processing and a speed of communicating. Other times it's understanding verbal heard language. So we're going to pivot, even though it's a separate category, in a sec when we talk about modeling. That'll be super important. But it for us to modify how we communicate with our person will help them to be more successful. One thing I was thinking about, I think it came up this morning. It's a little bit, the days kind of run together sometimes, is sometimes we're tempted to be clever with our person. So maybe say a joke or maybe a little bit of sarcasm. And you may be cautious with that because sometimes, very often, at least in my experience in the dementia journey, sarcasm and especially jokes that aren't like, are a little bit too complicated or aren't puns or something can be kind of hard to process. So you might be cautious about that. Now, in communication, I also wanted to add a few other follow-ups. So if your person has aphasia, so aphasia can be a part of frontal temporal degeneration. So I'm going to say a few sentences. I'm going to go into the weeds for just a sec. I talk about FTD a lot, frontal temporal degeneration, because it is an uncommonly known dementia, and it is very often difficult to diagnose and often can be diagnosed as something else incorrectly first. And one of the common impacts of FTD, frontotemporal degeneration, is language impact. And so FTD itself is an umbrella, and there are specific diagnoses under it. So there's behavioral variant, there's primary progressive aphasia, corticobasal syndrome, etc. We don't need to go into, I just love talking about FTD. But for aphasia, whether or not it is under the umbrella of FTD, I like to think of aphasia or explain aphasia as our person is understanding the words up here in their brain. They're understanding the words that you're saying, they're understanding the words that they are saying. But when they go to speak them, it comes out differently from what they intend. So, especially under FTD, there's 3 different categories of aphasia. We don't need to talk about that right now. For our general purposes, you'll either tend to hear somebody with aphasia who is speaking words that they think are clear, but you and I do not understand as clear language. So it may be kind of mumbled, or it may be jumbled words, or words that sound like the language that we speak, but not quite. Or there's the opposite end of the spectrum, which is this really complicated language, this language that is just like so many words and so many complicated words, and kind of like an unnecessarily complicated grammar structure. So it's kind of 2 ends of the spectrum for a person. But if our person has aphasia, they may also be impacted in certain types of speech. So maybe they can speak the words, but they have difficulty with nouns, for example. But anyway, I'm in the weeds. If your person has aphasia, know that they may think they are communicating clearly. So it can be super frustrating for them. Like, I just told you this thing, or they come to you and they are mad about something and they're explaining it, and you're like, I don't understand. They probably understand what you are saying. So don't make the mistake of thinking, oh, my person has aphasia. I don't understand them. They don't understand me. That's often not the case. Often they do understand you. So still be really intentional about your language and what you speak. If your person has aphasia and if you're uncertain what they're communicating with you, try to repeat back what they've said. This is easier in some cases than in others. I always think of Teepa Snow had a great example, and this was when I was in my first care community in Seattle, and this was like not quite 15 years ago. And I still remember her walking up to somebody, and she goes, "I need a pert," and the person was like, "Oh," like you like just this moment of panic. And the instruction she gave us is simply to repeat back. You need a pert. So, if nothing else, you're telling your person that you are engaged with them. Then, if you're uncertain, or even if you aren't following this step, a good rule of thumb for somebody with aphasia is, can you show me? They may need to ambulate over there to show you, or they may say, well, it's a pert. It's this right here. And so you're like, ah. But often your person knows what they intend to say. It's just not coming out like they plan. Okay. I feel like I'm talking too much today, so I hope we're on the right path. If anybody's comfortable, if you want to put in the chat, if you feel like we're on the right path or too in the weeds or not specific enough. The other thing I'll say around communication is, if your person is quote unquote nonverbal, that doesn't mean you can't communicate with them, and it doesn't mean they can't communicate back. So there's a few things on the slides here that you can try. Music, always incredible, such a powerful force. If you're seeing me, traditional language is processed in a different part of the brain than where music is processed. So if you think back to those brain scans, often where language is processed is impacted in many of the dementias, but often where music is processed is not impacted. So your person may have difficulty verbally communicating, but if you play their favorite song, they may tap to it, they may even sort of hum, may even sing. So if anybody, if you've seen the famous video of Naomi File and Gladys Wilson, it's part of the Memory Bridge documentary. There is a bridge. It's incredible. I'm sure many of you have seen it, super famous, but how Naomi engages with this resident who, this individual, who I think for many of us appears to be removed, who appears to be not present, who appears to be turned inward. I'm sure some people in her life said that she was no longer there. And so Naomi uses music to connect. Some other ways you can connect and communicate with your person who is quote unquote nonverbal: dancing together, movement, massaging their hands with lotion, or simply ambulating with them. I think, especially in the late stage of the dementia journey, communication is connection. That's really all it is. It's all we're aiming for, that connection. And it doesn't always have to be this, that verbal. I think for many of us, we get so caught up in the verbal communication that we're kind of thrown for a loop when our person is on a dementia journey. But we can adjust, we can still communicate, we can still have connection with our person. Okay, so modeling. This is super important because of something I mentioned a few minutes ago around verbal communication. Often in the mid and late stage of the dementia journey, our person will have difficulty processing verbal communication. So the key here is that as much as we're able, we want to try to model what we're saying verbally, model that physically. So I tried to look for a couple examples that demonstrate that. But if I'm talking with a resident, like I'm in one of our communities right now, and I say, hey, come on, let's go, doing these big exaggerated hand motions. Or if I offer to take someone's plate in the dining room, I'll sort of like make a show of saying, like, pointing to the plate, may I take this? If I'm going to assist somebody in the restroom, and I might sort of push to their belt and say, hey, let's go to the restroom. Come on. Or I'll say, let's change our clothes. So us modeling that action can really help our person to better be successful and understand what we're trying to convey. Choice, and we talked about this in the January session as well. So in many of the dementia journeys, often the frontal lobe is impacted. So definitely with FTD, which is called frontal temporal degeneration, but many of the other dementias is the frontal lobe impacted. And that is where that's where a filter is. That is where our executive function, it's where we make decisions, it's where we initiate. So just as an aside, because this comes up often, sometimes a family will say to me, my mom doesn't, like, she just sits there, she doesn't want to do anything. And sometimes that ability to like get up and get going or start something or stop just sitting where we're at can be impacted in the dementia journey. So sometimes there are these things that we don't realize are a part of the journey. So the ability to initiate, the ability to make choice, to have executive function, to filter ourselves as well. So two best practices around choice. You want to still model those options. So we're back to our previous session. And a good best practice is to offer two choices. Many more than two often becomes like too much for our person to process. Now, your person may have MCI or maybe at an earlier stage in their journey, and they may be able to make a ton of choices. I was thinking last night about some different images because this is the image I've used for a while, but I think it, even if it's not as applicable for your day to day, I think it illustrates. So if Uh, for example, if Kirsten is visiting me and I'm a resident in one of our communities, and she says, "Hey, Auntie, let's go to the park. You need your jacket. Why don't you get your jacket?" And she opens up the closet, and there's all these clothes there. And sometimes just seeing like too many things, I have difficulty choosing. And sometimes I have difficulty distinguishing between them, or I sort of get lost in the process, or they're all there and I'm not certain. But if Kirsten were to pull out two and say, would you rather, I know you love your flannel, you love plaid flannel, feel how nice this feels. Or, oh, would you like your wool sweater? It's kind of nice and cozy, warm. So she's shown me two things and she's modeled them and invited me to also interact with them, to touch them, to feel them. And now I can be more successful in choosing between those two. It's not that we're limiting, it's that we're adjusting so our person can be successful. The other thing I'll often hear is that people will sometimes think an individual with dementia can't make choice. And they can, and they are able, and that is definitely their right. And it's the onus is on us to modify that question or to make that setting where they can be successful. Our next one, so I think this is now number 4, if I'm counting correctly, is what I call segmenting. And this, I saw there's a social media or a speech language pathologist on social media I really like. And if you've seen our anthology memory loss resource sheet, she's on there. Her name is Adria Thompson, and her social media accounts are called Be Light, like BE and then light, Be Light Care. And she had a great video just a few days ago, and it was sort of like video from her perspective of how, like, the number of steps it takes for somebody to get up, to get out of bed, and go to the restroom. And so many times these steps, like get up, get out of bed, go to the restroom, take a shower, the example on the screen, or hey mom, why don't you go? I know you love to garden. Why don't you go out and do something in the garden? Or why don't you start a puzzle? So often, um, these steps are so it's like a multi-step process to get to the result. And we're just sort of shooing our person along, like, hey mom, go take a shower. But there's all these steps. And so I put on the screen, I think about 7 of them, and we could break that down even further. And you may, especially if your person is living in one of our communities, but maybe you're inquiring of us. Maybe if you're assisting your person to eat their lunch or get ready in the morning, you may be tempted just to sort of push them along and say, go get ready. But there's so many steps involved. And so segmenting is where we break down the big process into manageable actions. And we may need to be present with our person and sort of verbally and physically prompt them, or we may be able to do that removed. But we break up that big task into little manageable bites. Helpful? Excellent. And then our next section is around validation and then reminiscence. And if we do, at many of our communities, we do a monthly support group. And I always record a brief video that our teams can use in the support group if they want. And so if you're a part of one of our support groups, and if our team member uses that video, this last month I did on validation. It's one of my favorite methods, because it is such a great way to help our person release some of that big emotional energy, and it also puts us in a real position of respect and equality with our person. So, um, and I'll say one more sort of background statement. So, what you're seeing on the screen right now is this excerpts of this amazing art show. It's Tom Hussey's art show. It's called Reflections of the Past. And a lot of the images are like this, where the person as we see them today, but in the reflection, how they see themselves. Either literally, they're more emotionally present or rooted at an earlier time in their lives, or it's just how they perceive themselves. So I think it's a really great show and really helpful. Validation was created by Naomi Feil, and her name, if you don't see the screen, is F like Frank, EIL. And I mentioned her before. That was that famous video with her and Ms. Wilson, and it's on the Memory Bridge documentary. But the reason I love validation is it causes us to lean in with our person. And so validation can be used when our person is sundowning, which is common in the dementia journey, or maybe our person is more emotionally rooted at a different time in their life. Maybe they live in one of our communities and you go to visit them and they say, I don't live here. What are you talking about? I'm here to work, or I help these old people, or something like that. So, validation is a way for us to lean in. And it's different from some methods that you all and we all have heard often, which are methods like redirection or distraction or therapeutic lying. Um, all of those like have their place. I know plenty of people use them and love them. But if our person is amplified, redirection or distraction is trying to like pull them out of it or change the subject, whereas validation leans in. It can be a really powerful way to connect with our person. And it can be a way for our person to sort of have some emotional release. Okay, I see a question in the chat. I want to make sure. Okay, awesome. So Jonathan says, the question is, oh, good. Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to come back to your question. Okay. So with validation, I will tell you, it can be hard, but it is worth trying. It's hard because, or it can be hard because we don't know where it's going to go. If in the example before, your person lives at one of our communities, you're visiting them and you say like, oh mom, let's go see your apartment. And she says, I don't live here. I'm just here to help these old people. You may be tempted to say, oh no, mom, remember, like you moved in over the summer and we picked out your apartment. Or you may be tempted to try to distract her. Or if you're leaving and she's like, I'm leaving, I gotta go home. But if you join in to validation, we don't know where it's going to lead, but often it is a freeing exercise for our person. So the first thing we do, let's say in the example, you're visiting your person, she says, you're leaving, I'm going to leave too, or I got to get home, or I need to pick up the kids, or whatever. First, we mirror their emotions and their language. So if our person is upset, we're upset. If they say, I got to get out of here, we say, you got to get out of here. Mirror that language. Number two, you respond with empathy. And our goal here is to cultivate connection, to slow down, to try to dig in deeper, not just simply to distract or change the subject. And so this takes a bit of time. And so I'm sure some of you right now are thinking like, oh, there's no way. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. If I need to go, I need to go. But if you try this, you may find it offers a deeper connection. And so number three is you ask simple questions or you offer prompts to pull that story out of them. And you, as family members, or you, as families of choice, you may be tempted to finish the story. She says, "Oh, I need to get home and help the kids." And you say, "Oh, I know you want to help baby Robert and Elizabeth and Jennifer." You may be tempted to fill in the details, but with validation, you want to draw those details out, not simply throw the details at them, but pull them out. If you're ever uncertain with validation, you can say, "Tell me about." If they say, "Well, I got it, the kids are waiting for me," you could tell me about the kids. If they say, "Have you seen my daughter?" You say, "Tell me about your daughter." You don't try to reorient them to reality, but you're curious. And often in this back and forth, and it'll take a little while, it'll take a few minutes, and you don't want to rush it. Often there'll be this opportunity to sort of pivot into something more positive. So if somebody's saying, like, "I gotta get home, but the kids are waiting and they're amped up," the more you back and forth dig, learn about the kids, and you say, "Oh, baby Robert, right?" And she goes, "Yeah, yeah, baby Robert. He cried all the time." And you go, "Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. You did such a good job with him." Or, "Gosh, was there ever a time that he didn't cry?" You sort of lean so deeply into it that you find a way, instead of like trying to pull them out of it, like force them out of their own space, you join them in it. So it can be super, super powerful. Okay, I'm going to say one more, and then I'm going to come to the questions from Alex and Jonathan. So number 7 is reminiscence. And this is because your person may, like I said before, they may be more emotionally rooted at a different time in their life. They may not recall what I call historic facts. So, "Mom, you moved into Anthology of Mason this summer." Or, "No, Mom, remember we sold the house and, you moved to Florida that summer," whatever. They may not have those specific historic facts, or they may combine different stories. I was talking with a family about a month ago, and their person had mixed up when they traveled to Florida for a summer vacation and some other thing. It was like this big dramatic fight that they had with their spouse. And they had combined those two stories together. And so, what we don't want to do with reminiscence or in this moment is to try to reorient our person to our reality and our history. Reminiscence is simply a way for us to connect and to be flexible. So, if your person is sharing a story, you want to ask sort of good discovery questions. Or if you're using a physical prompt, maybe you bring in the scrapbook or the old photo album or something. Instead of flipping through and saying, "Oh my gosh, Mom, wasn't this your wedding day?" Now, I thought it was a Saturday night because you couldn't get a daytime at the for mass, right? You might be tempted to ask all of these history questions. I would encourage you, especially if your person is in the mid or later stage of the journey, instead just ask open-ended questions like, "Oh my gosh, look at this wedding photo. What a beautiful bride." And just ask questions that are open-ended, that aren't based in history. And you may find that they're giving you more insight. Maybe stuff they've never told you, maybe stuff that is not historically accurate, but that's okay. Like, the point here is connection. So you don't want to get stuck in the details. I think very often of somebody in my own sphere, and they would be so quick to say, like, "No, it wasn't 2 weeks ago, it was 2 years ago." Like, so focused on time and chronology. And in the meantime, the person who's trying to share is getting discouraged and feels cut off. Um, And the last thing here, I encourage you to go slow. We have a method at Anthology that we say go slow to go fast. And the idea is that we first just connect through every step of the process. So I'm going to pause and respond to a couple questions, and then I'll highlight the additional methods and then we can stop the recording and we can open up for other questions. So Jonathan says, a question he was planning to bring up. Realize it's off topic. That's totally okay, Jonathan. I'm so glad you asked. How do we tell early dementia symptoms from regular aging of the brain? How do we know the point at which to encourage a family member to get a professional opinion? Oh, Jonathan, such a good question. Because sometimes, and kind of the reason why I'm harping on these details, um, I think so often we focus on memory. We focus on, is my person safe at home? Or is my person safe to drive? But we're sometimes overlooking some of these other symptoms. So let's allay some of our fears right now. We all lose things all the time, right? I lose my phone. I ask Alexa to call it. That ability to lose something, but then to retrace your steps is great. That's a normal part, a common part of all of our journey. Now, if we start to see our person or ourselves lose things in odd locations, or lose things and start to point outwards and be a little bit paranoid, well, those kids are always running around here and hiding my toilet paper, and you're like, okay, no kids here. The things I shared around visual processing impact, now that could be, of course, impacted visual abilities that are like biological. But some of what we're talking about in the impacted visual field is sometimes biological, but often is a processing issue as well. What was the other thing? Some people will talk a lot, Jonathan, about what they call normal versus not normal aging. And I kind of like, I feel a little bit anxious about that because, like, who of us is normal, right? But things to watch for are if your person is, let's say, in their home, or maybe they're in an independent living community, or they're in our assisted living community, whatever, and you start to see that they have difficulty navigating, or they're in the dining room and the menu is just like so long, and they look at it and you can see they're not really processing. Or at one of our communities last fall, excuse me, a gentleman was in the dining room and just so hard on the servers. Would place the order and then forgot that he'd placed the order, and then was irritated the server hadn't left it and then, or brought it, and then thought that the server was ignoring him. Like, it just kept spinning and spinning. So if you start to see your person having difficulty processing or being successful in an environment like dining room, restaurant, in their home, feeling anxious in their home, like closing all of the blinds because they're worried. They see their reflection and think somebody's looking in. Those things are all have tipping points that you might look at a transition. If your person is in one of our communities, maybe one of our independent or assisted living communities, and you're finding they're just not successful in that environment, memory care may be a great fit. I know for many families, they feel like memory care is a demotion. I just want my mom to be with other people who are more able. I get that. I totally get that thought process. Comma, and if you're finding your person is not successful in the dining, or they're getting lost in that large independent living neighborhood, or they're participating in the engagements, but they're not quite following. They're not quite successful. The beauty of memory care is it is designed to be a failure-free environment. So I hope that helped, Jonathan. And then Alex asks, so if someone does see themselves at a stage earlier in the life, so like the images of the person in the mirror, how do we communicate with the person when they don't understand why we won't do something for them? So, for example, why she can't be in charge of her own money, always ask for her money. Obviously, we can't tell her, remember, you have dementia. But how do we explain to her why she doesn't handle her money any longer? She's very confused, or she is very with it, not confused. Okay, excellent. So, Alex, there's a number of things we can address here. And I'm gonna say a general thing, and then I'm gonna speak specifically about the financial question. Um, because sometimes our person, there's something that's super common in the dementia journey. And you would think I would have learned how to say it by now, but I just haven't really tried. It's agnosia, something like that. And it means that I am unable to see my own deficits. And so you may be tempted to say, Mom, I told you, we got the dementia diagnosis, or Mom, you're not safe, or Mom, you're not able. And they're like, what are you talking about? I am fully able, because they're just not able to see it. Um, um, so that is like a general statement. Now, I do want to highlight something about the person in the mirror, which I think you're referencing that art show, but I'm just going to say, just in case you mean literally, because sometimes our person, not always, but sometimes, they will see their reflection in the window and think it's somebody wanting to come in, or they'll see their reflection in the mirror and think, who is that old person? Or like, I wave and they wave, or I do this and they're mocking me. So if that's a case for your person, which is not common, but does happen, it might be worthwhile to cover or diminish that reflection so that it doesn't become such a trigger for your person. But that's me getting on a tangent. So especially around the finances, and I'm going to throw in driving as well because that often comes up. For some of our people, it is helpful to have a grounding document, the report from the DMV, the report from the provider. Sometimes that is helpful. And I sort of lead with that with caution, because so often we're tempted to try to explain with reason to our person. And very often, even in the early stage of the dementia or MCI or whatever CTE journey, um, often trying to reason with our person is not where we win, is not where they're successful. But sometimes to have like a grounding document for some of our people, that authority document, sometimes that's helpful. um, Sometimes it's enough to practice the Naomi's validation method. It's like, oh, that is so frustrating. Tell me, what is it you want to do for your finances? Like, try to really lean in to get a sense of what they're missing. Kind of a clumsy example I'll give is sometimes our person is going to ask us for something or express something, but the words aren't quite the emotion they're trying to convey. So uh, sometimes a person might say, a person who's in her 90s, say to me, have you seen my mother? I'm looking for my mother. Now, they may in that moment be looking for their mother, or they may just be looking for like comfort and security. And I don't know where I'm supposed to be. And my mom would know, that sort of uh, like where the words are not quite precise. Okay, so sometimes there's I want to give you maybe two other tips that might be helpful for the financial in particular. Um, Sometimes it's helpful for your person to have their own account. And so maybe it's an account. And so some you all take this with a grain of salt, because plenty of you on this call, this would not be helpful, but this might be helpful in Alex's case. To have a separate account, it may be the main account that they're accustomed to that just has a little bit of dollars in it. So that way they have that sense of autonomy and control, but the other dollars are moved into other accounts. There is sometimes we're tempted to say, oh no, you got plenty of money here, let me show you the bank statement. And sometimes that's kind of like too much reality, right? Or today's inflation, it looks like something, and maybe if they're more emotionally present at an earlier time, the numbers just seem like out of whack. um, and then sometimes we can pivot into a different emotion. So our person may be wanting to have that sense of control, or that sense of uh, not magnitude, but sort of like legacy, like having a purpose, being important. Sometimes we can address those in other ways. Okay, good. So I'm going to highlight a couple things on here on the slide, and then I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can open it up for whatever other questions. So I included a few other methods and resources for you. And I think for our purposes today, I'm really just going to highlight two. One is the sensory interventions, and the other one is mindfulness and breathing, etc. Sensory interventions can be so powerful for a person, especially if they are in the later part of their journey. Sometimes when they're amplified, other times when they just may seem to us a little bit less connected. And so sensory interventions are a way for us to connect with our person, sometimes for us to stimulate some reaction or memory. So you may bring in, if there's a particular perfume that your person always wore or their beloved person always wore, you might bring that in and smell it and have them smell it and just see what sort of memories that jogs. Or other sort of domestic smells. So maybe fresh ground coffee or spices, or where I am today, the maintenance team member, the landscapers were here, and so it has this real fresh, earthy smell. um, think about those scents that can be activating for somebody, as well as like tactile functions. You may find that your person really seems to enjoy different textures and feeling, or you might find that, especially if your person's in the later part of their journey, that you may hold their hand and massage some lotion on there. You might find that as grounding. Then the mindfulness and breathing exercises, frankly, are good for both of us. They're good for you and they're good for your person. And so we can do that in a way that is simplified. For some of our persons, it's enough for us to say, let's do our meditation technique. And for others of our person, we'll need to say, like, Alex, we're going to do a deep breath. You ready, Alex? I'm sort of hitting my chest. I'm going to like have a real big, model that breathing in and breathe out. So sometimes we can do that. Okay. Let me pause. I'm gonna stop record. Recording.